Authoritarian leadership is really appealing to people who are afraid and demoralized and traumatized. And I think all of those strong, muscular nationalism leaders are tapping into trauma. I think the popularity is a reflection of some really deep distortions in culture that we're being called to heal, to address. It's tempting to say, oh, it came out of nowhere and it's just a madman. No, it's a mirror. It's a spotlight, an outcome of some really troubled parts of our society that needs to be addressed, not to fight the power, but to address the pain.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today my guest is Dr. Elizabeth Philipose, professor, author, and someone who manages to talk about empire, patriarchy, and trauma systems in a way that somehow leaves you feeling more hopeful, not less. Elizabeth teaches at Cal State San Marcos and leads transformative workshops at Esalen, including an upcoming one called Embracing the Divine Feminine, which, spoiler alert, is not just about essential oils and moon chants, but about dismantling centuries of colonial conditioning embedded in our nervous systems and our institutions. During this conversation, we explored how femininity, the body, and the earth have all been positioned as problems to be solved rather than as sources of wisdom. Why wellness that doesn't address structural injustice is basically a scented candle in a burning house. How identity can be both a tool for liberation and a potential trap. And why the Divine Mother might just be the antidote to late-stage capitalism. Elizabeth's thinking is sharp, soulful, and subversively optimistic. I gotta tell you, I came away feeling like consciousness itself might actually be a viable site of resistance. Here's my conversation with Elizabeth Philipose. In your Esalen course description, it's written, at the root of social, political, and economic inequities between men and women is the patriarchal culture's colonial denigration of femininity. I would love for you to unpack that.
I tend to talk about a paradigm. I talk about this 1492 paradigm, which is the paradigm of Euro-colonialism. Through that period of time, we got a lot of things that we're working with today. Contemporary globalization, Victorian gender roles, scientific racism. We got all these concepts of who people are and what their proper role is and how they're meant to be in the world. And so it's through that process, a particular kind of patriarchal system, the ideas about femininity that we get through that colonial and patriarchal framework are of inferior qualities, of femininity that is weak or passive. Femininity is seen to be a problem, right? A mystery that needs to be understood, known, dominated, controlled. And it's associated with the body. And in our system, in this Western philosophical system that we get through colonialism, the body is a problem. The body's a problem because it has an intelligence of its own. It can't really be controlled in all the ways that patriarchy would like to control things, yeah? It's systemic, we'll say, in every single institution, in every single organization, in every single part of our social, cultural, political system, there's a sense that the feminine is an inferior part of us. But it is larger than that. It's an inferiority attributed to any kind of feminine characteristics. So this is where we get homophobia and denigration of gay men who are performing some aspect of femininity, which is seen to be a weakness, right, or a flaw. So we also, see anything that is called feminine then is seen to be passive, inferior, and needing to be controlled. And so we think about our relationship to nature. The environment is characterized as female, Mother Nature. And, while on one hand, we claim to love our mothers, on the other hand, Mother Nature has been positioned as something that needs to be transformed, made productive, turned into value. It doesn't have an intrinsic value of its own. And that's part of a kind of colonial patriarchal approach as well. So, I just think at the crossroads of every single thing that we would call a problem today has so much to do with where we've situated the feminine.
This might be kind of a dumb question, but I'm kind of curious. Why is colonialism thought of as the starting point for subjugation of femininity? Isn't it likely that there was subjugation of femininity for thousands of years before 1492?
Yeah, I mean, different people trace patriarchal relations. There's different starting points. I'm not saying that this was the first time, right? But what I'm suggesting is a very particular characterization of femininity and the role of women that was tied to things like the emergence of the nation state. And we didn't have nation states before. That came through colonialism and the creation of a sovereign state system. Why does that matter? Why is that gendered? Well, that's where the state came to be understood as a masculine agent, a protector of the domestic, and where the domestic has the role of supporting the state. And femininity, women are located in the domestic. And so women's roles became about serving the public good, right? So states are very invested in things like population and population policy, right? And that who is reproducing the population. It's also the case, it's very much tied to capitalism and this system of economic production that we're in, where the household was understood as an economic unit. The household is a place where you have one agent that goes into the world and makes wages, and you have another agent who stays home and reproduces daily life, right? And that's the feminine. The whole economy depends on somebody doing the work of the feminine, let's say it this way, unpaid, voluntary, invisible, right? All the work of sustaining a household. It's not just the household, it is the foundation of the nation state. So we didn't have capitalism before, right? We didn't have the sovereign state system before. We didn't have this binary gender system that became scientized, right? So it became located in your biology. And it goes along with a scientific racism, which also locates your worth in your biology. If your worthiness is in your biology, everything revolves around reproduction, reproducing the state, reproducing the race, keeping the economy going, all these things, right? And so that's why I look at it from that perspective. And we can, there's a lot of studies that developed over the years of what medics discovered about women's bodies in Polynesian countries, for instance, or, a lot of the colonial power revolved around containing, controlling, knowing the female.
I'm interested to hear how wellness fits into this critique as well, because you introduce a notion of decolonial wellness.
Sure. So, the systems that we've inherited that bring us to this moment, right? They're trauma systems. They're trauma systems because they are hierarchical, because they do rely on an idea of someone who's superior and someone who's inferior. They're trauma systems because they rely on separation, right? They separate things that really shouldn't be separated, like people. So there's a way in which the oppression, being situated as inferior, being denied opportunities, and having that happen consistently throughout your life, right? So a lot of our system is based on appearance. We're really quick to judge, right? Masculine and feminine. It's sort of automatic processing that we do. It's not conscious, it's implicit, and it's learned over a long time. When we're in the world, our bodies are like the front line of meaning making. That becomes part of like a trauma. It's a regular daily experience, right, of being evaluated simply on the basis of how you're showing up. And that gets internalized. That becomes part of how your body responds, how your nervous system fires, how your brain chemistry works. It becomes part of your subjectivity, how you see yourself in how others are mirroring you. This all results in a kind of traumatized body. It results in disease, right, and unwellness. They have studied people even at higher income levels. So they're looking at upper middle class people who are racialized, the incidence of stress on their systems, right? And it's measurably higher for people of color in the United States than it is for white-bodied people. And it's because that assault is constantly happening on them, right? And that stress shows up as high blood pressure, it shows up as accelerated heartbeat, respiration, it shows up as inflammation. Our wellness is very much tied to, right, these systems and structures that divide us, separate us, evaluate us, compare us, right? Create those sorts of hierarchies. So a decolonial wellness is a kind of approach to our whole system wellness to go to the root, right, of what harms us. And the root is in these systems and structures of power. I think part of being well is also having the knowledge. So sometimes you think low self-esteem is just neutral, right? Everybody's got it. But if you take the experience of women and low self-esteem, it's very much tied to a gendered reception of them in the world, right? It's not just generic low self-esteem, it's gendered low self-esteem, and it shows up in gendered ways. And I can say that for masculine too, that men are gendered in ways that, even though it seems like privilege, which it is, it's also harmful. And it's harmful because it's containing people's wholeness in these very rigid ideas of who you're meant to be.
Yeah, well, let's talk about identity.
First, I'll say, part of what I've learned from feminism over the years and what I teach and share, feminism's teaching us that we are more than the world tells us. That these are social and political and cultural identities, but they're not the sum total of who we are. There's a bigger version of our identity that's not materially based, and that's not situated in our biologies. And so I think, working with feminism and the ideas about how we get constructed in these ways and how femininity is defined for political reasons, we start to get a clue to that larger identity that we are. And it's a much bigger self than we're led to believe, right?
I'm imagining kind of a radical disidentification from ideas like gender, race, and nation, some of which could be constructed. I guess my question is, how can we disidentify without disassociating from struggle, history, community, etc.?
Yeah, right. And so you're kind of speaking to the trouble of bypassing these things. I do feel like, there's very much an inner process that has to happen, inner self-reflection, which I think is also where feminism takes us to, is cultivating a relationship with our own authenticity. That's what I think of as wholeness. That's what I think of as, alignment, a mind, body, spirit. What I say, what I do, where I go, that all these things line up, right, as something truthful about myself. I think authenticity is a foundation of disidentification. And how you get there is we have to go through the limitations, right? Like any kind of spiritual practice that takes us to a new awareness goes through the material, it goes through the sorrow, it goes through the grief, right? It doesn't bypass it. But it's the idea of processing our earthly experience, right, through that history of struggle we have evolved. Consciousness has evolved. The idea of being limited by gender or race or class, those things as identifiers, I think it's becoming less and less a grip on us as we know a bigger version of ourselves.
Well, I love the optimism that you reflect here. I'm not sure when I look at mainstream culture that we've evolved in a very deep way, because it seems like some of the concerns that you're bringing, in fact, dominate the way we interact with one another.
Yeah, if you just take the United States as an example of a complex, multidimensional society, what we see most represented are the dominant ideas of the dominant class, the interests that are tied to a need to control people.
Hmm.
Right? So those systems of gender and race and all of that is designed so that we know our proper place and we fulfill our proper roles, right? What we're hearing is that agenda. But right from the beginning, that struggle of who is fully human, who is worthy of being an American. Wherever there is oppression, people have been struggling against it, right?
Yeah.
So that's partly where my optimism comes from.
I love that, but how does it account for the seeming popularity of systems such as autocracy, which we see across the globe?
Authoritarian leadership is really appealing to people who are afraid and demoralized. The parallel movements of trauma and fear, yeah. This president in the United States, I think of him as a trauma president, and I think all of those strong, muscular nationalism leaders, right, are tapping into trauma. I think the popularity is a reflection of some really deep distortions in culture that we're being called, to heal, to address. These leaders, they're not, it's tempting to say, oh, it came out of nowhere and it's just a madman. And it's tempting to portray it that way, right, as some alien feature. No, it's a mirror. It's a spotlight, an outcome,
Yeah,
right,
right.
of some really troubled parts of our society that needs to be addressed, not to fight the power, but to address the pain. I don't think people are yearning for autocracy. They're yearning for a savior. This president really can speak to people. He essentially said, I feel your pain. I know your pain. Fearful, traumatized people are also looking to blame scapegoats, right? And so these authoritarian leaders, trot out the scapegoats. And so they come with also the answer to your problems, seemingly. I would say it's backlash to what's already evolved in our consciousness. So the response is to try and lock it down and try and make it disappear. Right? That idea of going back to a time when things were good. Well, back to a time when things were good is before the second wave of the women's movement. It's before the Civil Rights Act. There's a clearly, a racial and gendered idea about restoring a certain kind of power. But it's backlash, and I think that's the good news in the sense that there's been an evolution in consciousness, and the old power wants to hold on to old power, but we've moved beyond that. We're already somewhere else.
You've said imperialism abroad is the partner of authoritarianism at home. And tell me more.
So it's referred to as the boomerang effect. It's the idea that for imperialist purposes, government becomes authoritarian at home. People who are protesting the violence in Gaza are being arrested or deported or held in this moment. There's been all kinds of rules, and that's before this president, actually, all kinds of rules since last spring preventing protest and free speech on campuses that have to do with Israel. And it comes under a large concern about anti-Semitism. What is that about? Well, our U.S. foreign policy is very invested in the state of Israel. That's a partnership since 1948. Israel is crucial to U.S. foreign policy. And so the support for Israel is the support for the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and it's mirrored at home by authoritarianism, where we're not allowed to talk about it. These actions to suppress people abroad always comes home. After 9/11, everything got consolidated under Homeland Security, right? It essentially turned the state into a clear security and surveillance state. And it was ostensibly to root out Muslim terrorists. So what happens is that in the United States now, we have laws that permit indefinite detention. We have laws that permit wiretapping and surveillance, right? We have laws that allow censorship around libraries and books that you can read. That all came during that period, right? And so ostensibly it's about Muslim terrorists, but all those rules apply to all Americans. And so we lost privacy rights. We lost basic elements of democratic systems, right? Does that make sense?
You've said that consciousness itself can be a site of activism. So I'm curious to hear more about that and how people might begin to work on their own ways of knowing.
Mm-hmm. It's a spiritual teaching that consciousness precedes form. Consciousness is more than just our thoughts, our intellect, and all of the belief systems of a culture and all of the bodily comportments of a culture. All of that is involved in consciousness. System of capitalism started to emerge in the 1700s or so in Europe, and it emerged from the immediate needs of deprivation and scarcity. Scarcity consciousness is kind of at the back of capitalism, and it's a consciousness that there's not enough to go around. Nature doesn't produce enough, and because of that, we have to compete. Right? And we have to constantly acquire and extract value. Because of that scarcity consciousness, there's an assumption that poverty is inevitable. That consciousness gave birth to form, to institutions, to ways of being that we just accept, right, as true. Say we approach building an economic system from the consciousness of abundance. Well, first of all, is nature abundant? Yes. Does nature ever stop producing? No. Right? Even materially, is there enough food to go around? Well, people who study that can show you that there's more than enough food circulating on the global market for everybody to eat. From that consciousness, we would not create institutions that run on greed, because we're starting from the basis that there is enough, right? We have to check, right, what belief systems, what kinds of things are running us that appear to be true, that we take for granted, or that are lodged in our unconscious. I think the idea of scarcity is lodged in our unconscious until it's not, right? Until we become aware of it. Our international system is really based on the idea that war is inevitable. Not just poverty, but war is also inevitable. And that too, I think we can look around the world and look at the millions and billions of interactions that are happening every day that are not warring, that are not violent. Every day, mothers are taking care of children. How many times is that happening? All day long, all around the world, right? Mm-hmm. Every day, people are caring for other people. Right? Every day, people are having conversations like this that involves zero violence, right? When we're thinking, oh, well, war is the worst thing that can happen, and it's inevitable, and etc., that is sort of self-fulfilling. that emerges as institutions that are preparing for war and all of that. But if we really look at what's true and real and much more ubiquitous, what we find is peace. And so, how do we build societies around peace, given that that is more the truth of us than war?
You've connected mothering, both literal and archetypal, to this wholeness and grounding and building systems of peace. Can you talk a bit about what it means to you to reclaim the divine mother in today's fractured world?
Part of being askew with the feminine is being askew with the mother. That severed connection really leaves us alone, really leaves us feeling disconnected from the very source of us. The consciousness of mother is something that we need to cultivate more of, I think, to get over some of the trauma that we're experiencing. There's a theorist I like, Sonia Renee Taylor, who talks about radical self-love, which refers to as the original love, the love of self that we came in with. We didn't put ourselves down because, when we're learning to walk, we couldn't keep ourselves up. We didn't fall down and say, oh, stupid legs, or we just got up, We didn't sit in our high chair and think, wow, my belly's so fat, And that radical self-love, I think, is the integration, the alignment. All of our parts are in agreement. No part of us is antagonistic to us. And that's, I think, in us, right? That original love, that original alignment, that original wholeness. It's all somewhere buried under worldly information.
Do you maintain a kind of optimism for our future, given the present that we're living in today?
I do. And one thing about the present that we're living in today, it's a period of massive civilizational change. And I would say it is a massive shift from that 1492 paradigm into something else. What matters on what we do, our consciousness, and what we call forth and what we invite. Like, you can't guarantee what's coming, but I can tell you what's passing. As things crumble, we're in a field of wide open possibilities. I would say the other thing, and what kind of sealed it for me was learning spiritual principle. So I've always been into social justice, and there was always a little niggle of doubt whether this was possible and could I really invest in this. At some point, when I started on my adult spiritual path, I heard a teacher say, your true nature is peace. The true nature of the cosmos is peace. And it just sort of like hit me here, like, oh, that's the answer. Is a dignified life for everybody possible? Well, yeah, it is, because it's the design, and that's a higher intelligence that created it that way. We've just gone wrong. We've just distorted a lot of things along the way.
I'd like to give you a chance to speak about the workshop that you'll be leading at Esalen, May 26th to May 30th. It's called Embracing the Divine Feminine, a Mystical Approach.
Yeah, so it is really about doing two things over the few days we're together. So one is unraveling the limited beliefs and worldly teachings that we've received about the feminine, including the idea that only women are feminine. So we're going to spend some time unraveling that, investigating where it lives in us, how it manifests. We're going to do some guided journeying to connect with the mother, to connect with our wholeness. And we're also going to think about how it is that consciousness manifests in our relationships. I say it's for all genders because femininity is a cosmic quality. And, it's meant to be in balance with masculinity within us and between us. So we're going to spend also some time talking about how masculinity is constructed in this society and the expectations, and how that puts us askew as well from the feminine. So it's a combination, I would say, of some knowledge, guided exercises, self-reflection, critical thinking, and also an immersion in oneness.
Leave you with one last question, Elizabeth. What are you appreciating and loving about yourself lately?
Well, I think it's just a willingness to share and give. And it comes from a kind of freedom and liberation to be able to just give and share. Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.
Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Not that anyone is asking, but I use ChatGPT to help me write my intros and to generate some questions for my guests. Never let the suggestions of a large language model supplant your own creativity. In other words, edit, curate, and add your own point of view. Think critically, because why not?